And now I will introduce Nader Fergany. Give you a break. Dr. Fergany is an Egyptian sociologist and economist. He was the founding lead author of the Arab Human Development Report 2002-2005, sponsored by the United Nations Development Programme and the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development. He obtained his BS from the Faculty of Economics and Political Sciences at Cairo University and his PhD from the University of North Carolina in the USA. He is presently the director of Almishkat Center for Research and Training in Cairo. Dr. Fergany taught and did research at numerous institutions in Egypt and outside, and acted as a consultant to many Arab and international organizations. He published on demography, international migration, labor markets, education, and development in Egypt and the Arab countries. His most recent book, Arab Revolution in the 21st Century, Lessons from Egypt and Tunisia, was published by Palgrave in 2016. Please welcome Dr. Fergany.
Thank you, Rima. A rather long title, so I'll leave you with it for a second. But the operative phrases are highlighted. Hadr. These are two quotes that I will leave with you, just to warn you that if you get the paper from Karim or Rima, there is an annex that develops the ideas here in a much fuller way. Let me start by some context and perhaps conceptual issues. ALT is the acronym I use for Arab Liberation Tide, which is the title I prefer for the unfortunate misnomer, the Arab Spring. I think what we witnessed near the end of the first decade of this century is the beginning of what might end up as the great Arab revolution of the 21st century. I understand what's happening now, but I want to stress the fact that these popular uprisings erupted in response to long decades of oppression and impoverishment in many Arab countries. It's not surprising that the slogans of these uprisings clamored for decent livelihood, freedom, social justice, and human dignity. But these uprisings erupted against a formidable array of foes, not only the authoritarian rule regimes that they wanted to overthrow, but their counterparts and supporters in the region and in the world. Hence, a very fierce counter-revolution erupted. And here I would like to just make sure that we understand that the very dire conditions we face in many Arab countries today are not the results of the uprisings, they are the results of the counter-revolution. I start from standard tenet that knowledge is power, but knowledge works both ways. I mean, it can be a liberating factor for the oppressed, but it's also used to manipulate the masses by authoritarian rule regimes. In principle, I believe that despotic rule disdains knowledge and restricts information flows in societies. These are impossible to open up. You're sweet. In these authoritarian rule regimes, I believe the standard mode is that decision-making is guided mostly by the interests of the ruling despot or clique. I mean, there could be one ultimate despot, but normally he is surrounded by a small clique that shares the same interests. Under these regimes, many horrid facts of life, and there is every attempt made to cover up for these horrid facts of life, and hence to prolong reign of these despotic regimes, information or truth is covered up or manipulated. As a byproduct of this statistical data production, in many Arab countries face technical problems to start. I'll try to mention some of them as I go along. And they suffer deficiencies as a result of basic inefficiency of government bureaucracies in backward countries. But there is also, and to me this is more important, a process of deliberate manipulation of statistical indicators of human welfare. Hence, national data sources on indicators of human welfare should be handled with care and rigorously evaluated prior to use. I would like to single out here two related phenomena, unemployment and poverty. Let me go back to the present political conditions in Arab countries that I think give us the context in which indicators of human welfare should be understood and treated. I think now we are in this counter-revolutionary era. We have a very hot contest on power. I mean, I think the people of many Arab countries are still clamoring for their slogans of freedom, social justice, human dignity, and so on. But this fierce counter-revolution is trying to oppress this struggle. And as counter-revolutions are very ugly beasts, they produce horrible facts, and they try to cover up the truth in order to cover up their crimes. I would like to bring to your attention also that certain groups in society that are disadvantaged in one way or another, including women, young people, rural areas, and so on, suffer more during this process of reinstating oppression and impoverishment. And information on their state of affairs is also leaving a lot to be wanted. I want to very clearly, very briefly differentiate between two concepts of poverty. There is the human capabilities concept, which revolves around the deprivation from the acquisition of human capabilities or deprivation from the utilization of human capabilities by the people. The three fundamental human capabilities that are recognized are acquisition of knowledge through education and so on, health, and in my opinion, above all, freedom. My favorite concept of freedom is an extensive one that extends from individual freedoms to freedom on the national level, which means self-determination and national liberation. Let me take a minute on freedom. I claim that freedom is severely restricted in most Arab countries, one way or another, according to one concept or another of freedom. Hence, in this human capability approach, I think poverty is rampant in Arab countries, using freedom as a most important capability. Nevertheless, this fundamental concept of human capabilities poverty, whether it's deprivation of acquisition or deprivation of effective utilization in social activities, is not the most prevalent concept of poverty. The most widespread, the most prevalent form is low levels of income or expenditure, which is propagated by international financial institutions, mainly the World Bank and the IMF. The basic idea here is that a person or a household and a social entity is considered poor if their income or expenditure falls below a certain cut-off point called the poverty line. So we set a poverty line on the basis of some criterion, and a person or a household that falls below this is poor, above it is not poor. Forgive me. I have a rather problematic issue here. I think there is a syndrome that I call unemployment poverty that affects many Arab countries. And the main issue here is that unemployment in many Arab countries leads to poverty in the following sense. I mean, unemployment is a failure of utilization of the human capability through participation in economic activity. But even in the monetary-based sense of poverty, unemployment leads to low-income poverty or low-expenditure poverty. Because in most Arab countries, the owners of capital assets are a few. Hence, the most important, if not the only, means of securing an income to lead a decent living is to sell labor power. So hence, if you can't sell your labor power, you have no income. In the low-income expenditure concept, you're poor. You end up poor. However, whether we speak of unemployment or poverty, especially in the monetary low income or low expenditure concept, we have problems with measurement in less developed countries. Let me give you a very quick idea on what we get from international data sources on the extent of poverty in Arab countries. My basic contention here is that poverty is much more prevalent in Arab countries than we get from government statistics or international data sources that are based on government statistics. Let me give you a very quick example. The World Development Indicators data set, the World Bank data set, around the time reference 2010, gives estimates of poverty ratios for 4 Arab countries: Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, and Iraq. In Egypt, for example, the estimate for 2010 was 22%. A later publication of the World Bank gives an estimate of the poverty ratio for Egypt that goes up to 41% in 2007. But this is, in my opinion, defective because it uses a very low poverty line. It sets the cutoff point between poor and non-poor at a very low level, and I'll give more details later on. If you go through international data sources, you hardly get indicators of poverty for many Arab countries, especially the oil-rich Arab countries. Of course, there is some justification for this, is that these are countries that have some of the highest values of per capita income in the world. But if we learn something from development economics, is that per capita income is not a good indication of welfare, definitely not distribution, definitely not poverty. I claim here that art and media have been more informative than social science on the issues of unemployment, poverty, and related human tragedies. Let me shock you with a favorite tragedy of mine. This is a case that was reported in the media in Egypt a couple of years ago. This is a single mother, a divorced woman with a young child who kept looking for a job for 5 years in a row and didn't find one. In an act of final desperation, she killed her child and committed suicide. She couldn't fend for him. There are many other sad stories and tragedies, but I will refrain from that now. Official government statistics give us this rather, in my opinion, rosy picture of poverty ratios in Egypt between the year 2000 and 2013, using the household income and expenditure statistics that were referred to in the previous presentation. If you believe this, then only 26% of the population of Egypt can be considered poor. As we shall see later, a minor adjustment that is very reasonable, this is a very low underestimate. What's the problem with the government statistics and international sources on poverty that are mostly based on government statistics in Arab countries? The previous graph that ended up with a quarter of Egyptians being considered poor in 2013 is based on a poverty line of 11 Egyptian pounds. That's a person who gets more than 11 Egyptian pounds per day is not considered poor. Now, this is 11 Egyptian pounds that was used in 2010 and is still being used until today. At the time it was first used in 2010, 11 Egyptian pounds were slightly more than $1. Now $1 is more than 13 Egyptian pounds. But let's stay for a minute with the 11 pounds. What could 11 pounds in Egypt buy? Especially in 2016 prices. I give here the quick and dirty indicator of the price of a full sandwich. Is there anybody here who doesn't know what a full sandwich? Okay. A full sandwich now in Egypt costs no less than 2 pounds. So this person with 11 pounds in his pocket can afford to have 5 full sandwiches all day. And that is the rest of his life. I mean, there's nothing else happening. He can't get anything else. Now, World Bank data and IMF data are based on these. There has always been a tension between government data and international organizations that have statistical databases. Part of it is objective, but part of it is mean. The objective part is that international organizations always try to standardize and make their data comparable, which does not always please governments who take pride in their own indicators and say these are the ones that should be considered genuine. But I judge that many international data sources, not only the World Bank and the IMF, but the ILO as well, underestimate indicators of human welfare, especially in the case of the ILO, the rate of unemployment. In the paper, you have some details on that. But I would like to add now, in addition to the problems international organizations have dealing with national government statistics and their quest for standardization and comparability, they also sometimes have an axe of their own to grind. In the case of poverty, I claim that the World Bank and the IMF have invested heavily in the regimes that the popular uprisings aim to overthrow. And they are still investing in the regimes that are present today, including the one in Egypt, which is a military dictatorship. So they really had an axe to grind. Why is that? You probably all know of the so-called Washington Consensus, which is an informal and sinister, in my opinion, alliance of the IMF, the World Bank, and the US Treasury. Why are they interested in propping up despotic regimes that impoverish and oppress their people? Simply because both the Washington Consensus and those despots serve world capitalism. I mean, most Arab despots are very diligent servants of world capitalism. But also, the World Bank and the IMF suffer a basic knowledge problem. They believe in new liberal policy frameworks, which is based on neoclassical theory, which any decent undergraduate student of economics knows is basically unfit for application in less developed countries, because they assume mature capitalist economies which are not present in any less developed country. So there is a mixture of bad ideology and sinister vested interests. It's not only supporting low estimates of poverty. Let me give you another example. Since September 11, 2001, every financial transfer in the world had to go through a New York facility. Now, while all the despots in the Arab liberation tide countries were stealing the money of the people and smuggling it off the country, mostly in safe havens in the West, the World Bank and the IMF didn't even know of it. Only after Ben Ali in Tunis and Mubarak in Egypt fell, we started to know of the billions upon billions that were transferred from their banking systems to safe havens in the West. I believe that human capabilities poverty gives us better data and better understanding of the extent of poverty in Arab countries. I start with something that's very dear to my heart, and a measure of human capability poverty based on the deprivation of young girls from access to basic education. I think this is a major crime. It's not only inducing poverty, but it's also violating a fundamental human right of young girls. If you go to the World Bank data, they don't publish it for this reason, of course, but it shows that there has been, up to 2010, a significant amount of deprivation of young girls from basic education in many Arab countries. I was shocked, and I think you would be shocked. There are countries, some of them very rich financially, that still harbor the crime of deprivation of young girls from basic education. We have 24 in 2010, around 2010, 24,000 in Kuwait, 164,000 girls in Saudi Arabia excluded from primary education. Now, if this is not poverty, what rubbish is you get from poverty lines and 11 pounds per day and so on? In some Arab countries, the number of girls, I'm deliberately using absolute figures here because on issues like that, the deprivation of even one girl from her right of basic education is a crime, in my opinion. But in some Arab countries, in 4 Arab countries actually, the number of girls deprived from their fundamental right to basic education surpassed the 100,000 girls point. Egypt is a very important case here because you might not know that the first formal, not informal, the first formal school for girls was set up in Egypt more than 140 years ago. Yet, until today, until 2010, using this data, girls were excluded from primary education 12 times more than boys. For those who are keen on relative indicators, this graph shows the sex differential in exclusion from basic education in Arab countries. That's to say, among those excluded from basic education, what's the ratio of girls to boys? And if there is no gender bias, it should be around 100%. But you see here that it goes, even in a rich country like Kuwait, to probably 14 times. In Egypt, as I said, it was about 12 times. The importance here is the overall impression. I mean, the exact position of one country next relative to the other is not that important because the data is not that good anyway. But the general impression is that in Arab countries, even some financially rich, affluent Arab countries, girls are still excluded from basic education, not only in large numbers, but also on a much higher level than boys. To me, this is a most telling indicator of poverty. Let me add just one point here, because as I said, this is something that's very dear to my heart. This not only expresses, this phenomenon not only reflects injustice and discrimination, it reflects societal stupidity. Why? Because girls happen to be the better educational achievers in all Arab countries, in all stages of education. So these are societies that deprive their better human resource from the ability to contribute to society. Let me go very quickly through another indicator of human capability poverty, which is unemployment. It's deprivation from utilization of capabilities in economic activity, which would lead to low income or low expenditure poverty as well. In the paper, I also give data showing what has become to be known as a structural feature of Arab economies, a high level of unemployment. In spite of the difficulties with the data and so on, but this is, to my mind, and I have done a lot of work on that also, an established structural feature of Arab economy. Much higher level of unemployment compared to other regions of the world, whether developed or underdeveloped. Worse, the characteristics of unemployment make its social impact, or its impact on human welfare, even worse, because it's what I call disadvantaged groups: women, young people, the poor, rural areas suffer higher rates of unemployment. So unemployment, the characteristics of unemployment exacerbate its negative social impact. Let's look at low-income expenditure poverty. As I said before, it would be rather hard to find an estimate of poverty in Saudi Arabia in international data sources. But fact of the matter is there is abject poverty in Saudi Arabia. The trouble is it lives side by side with flagrant extravagance. And poverty in Saudi Arabia does not only affect citizens, but definitely expatriate workers in it. I move now to other measures of human capability poverty derived from the Household Income and Expenditure Survey. I will move, before I close, to the low-income expenditure. But this is an interesting indicator, and here I have two sets of indicators trying to approximate the same phenomenon: lack of access to education, deprivation of knowledge capability through education. And you would see here that there are two sets of indicators. One is the standard illiteracy rates, which is subject to interpretation both by the respondent and the data collector. And the other one is firmer. It is no education. Person has not been to any educational facility. And I think the one on no education is much firmer ground to base ourselves when we are concerned with deprivation of the capability of knowledge. Compare the levels. If you take the standard literacy rates, you would end up with a much lower level of human capability poverty than if you use the no education indicator. More important, this is a set of surveys of household income and expenditure surveys that are relatively comparable, although the methodology suffered a break somewhere in the middle. But here I would like to point to the no education indicator in the younger age groups. And you'll see that they're not only relatively high, but they have not improved between 2004 to 2013, which is a time span that covers the popular uprising of 2011. So that section in the paper, in the presentation, shows that poverty has not ameliorated after the popular uprising. There is an explanation in the paper, but I don't have to go through it here. So if you compare the last two time points, you see that lack of education has persisted at about the same level. This is the other human capability poverty indicator, unemployment. And here the important point to note is the two younger age groups, 10 to 19 and 20 to 29. And you'll see that the rate of unemployment is still extremely high compared to other age groups, the older age groups. And it has not improved, or it has not declined after the 2011 popular uprising. Let me give you a very quick look at the extent of inequality. The standard measure is the Gini coefficient, which is a measure that ranges between 0 and 1. 0 meaning perfect equality, and 1 meaning total inequality. Again, according to this, you'll see that inequality in Egypt is on the low side. I mean, the Gini coefficient is about 40%. But this brings to my analysis a very important deficiency in the distribution of income and expenditure in many less developed countries, but mostly Arab countries. It's called the truncation of the upper tail of the distribution. I mean, the upper tail, that's very high income and expenditure values. And normally it is underreported. It's especially underreported in societies where very high incomes are derived from criminal activities or corruption. So in most Arab countries, this upper tail of the distribution is truncated. You can't have an accurate Gini coefficient. Let me perhaps shock you with a little more on this. Since then, the government in power now, a military regime, has been exacerbating the extent of inequality in a rather sinister way. Excessive rewards for tools of oppression of the people. Fresh MD or a fresh engineer can get a salary of £1,200 a month. Yet a junior army officer or police officer or an assistant prosecutor gets about 10 times as much. Now look at the tragedy of what this means in terms of rewards to excellence in education. I mean, a person to get into engineering or medicine in Egypt now has to score 100% or more. Don't laugh. It's an irony of scoring systems in Egypt. To get into medicine or engineering, you need to get 100% or more. But to get into military school or a police academy or law, you need to barely pass. So, hence, you're rewarding your mediocrity. I mean, rewarding mediocrity in education. This is bad enough if we think of the present, but think of the future. I mean, what kind of society would be if you punish excellence in education? It goes worse. We have now a platoon of popular regime loyalists, masters of deception, media anchors who can earn more than £1 million a month. Yes? More than £1 million a month. And some of them insist on getting paid in dollars. They're smart. Add to this that these groups, the tools of oppression of the people, you might wonder on the side, why would a judge be an oppressor of the people? Because actually, the government in power has passed many unjust laws, very unfair laws, very unjust laws. And the government has bought the judges and they issue verdicts using these unjust laws and always meting out the maximum sentences. But all these groups also have the option of buying into corruption, tax exemption, sanctioned by the government and so on, land deals and so on. If you take retired army and police generals, they get fantastic pensions, but they are also appointed at high-level positions in government and in the private sector, and they earn an additional income. So, inequality, no matter what the official Gini coefficient says, must have deteriorated. Let us take a look at what I call a lower bound on poverty, on the poverty rate by rural urban residents, to get into our main concern here, the rural areas. This is using official CAPMAS, which is the Central Agency for Public Mobilization and Statistics, and by the way, headed by an army general, a gunnery general. Yes? Anyway, this shows, again, between 2008 and 2013, again covering the onset of the popular uprising, the rural-urban differential, and as you can see from the bars, that rural areas in the same region of the country end up with a much higher poverty rate, according to the official statistics. And it has not declined. Only in urban governments, the official statistics show a gradual rise in the extent of poverty, in the poverty ratio. But let me warn you that this horizontal scale here ends at 60%. But here we have the most impoverished of Egyptians, those living in rural Upper Egypt. Upper Egypt is the south. We have something like 50% of the population of this part of the country considered poor according to official statistics, but it is a lower bound, as I said, because this is based on the 11 pounds per day poverty line. This is another lower bound still. I took the original distributions of expenditure and applied a slightly more reasonable poverty cutoff point instead of the roughly $1 that in 2010 corresponded to 11 pounds. I used 2 pounds, which used to be, by the way, the World Bank recommended criteria. And here you see that rural Upper Egypt is almost 75% poor instead of the scale here ends at 80%. The relative pattern stays the same. But this is, in my opinion, still a lower bound. Why? An interesting observation. These calculations I did a couple of months ago. And I used a rate of exchange to the US dollar of 10 pounds, which was the real value of the dollar in the free market. The official central bank rate was lower, but that central bank rate is fictitious. I mean, because you can't go to the bank and buy dollars. People have to buy their dollars. Most people have to buy their dollars from exchange companies, and their rate was 2 months ago about 10 pounds to the dollar. Now, since I have been revising the paper on the prodding of Martha and Ray, I have to warn you that the pound has plummeted to 13 pounds to the dollar in 2 months, which makes that 75% in rural Upper Egypt poverty rate still a lower bound. But this also tells you this is how fast the economy is deteriorating. At the risk of spoiling your appetite for dinner, I suggests that human welfare, poverty, and inequality in the country is likely to worsen in the near future. Two main factors are expected to contribute to this dire prognosis. By the way, both are conditions imposed by the IMF to lend this corrupt and authoritarian government a multi-billion-dollar loan. They're still investing in these regimes. The two changes that are expected to come soon as a condition for the government getting its loans, which will probably end up being smuggled outside the country anyway. Prices of fuel stuffs are going to be raised considerably. So the price of gasoline, solar, and so on will be increased. The second condition is that there's going to be a significant further devaluation of the Egyptian pound. Now, these are standard conditions of the IMF package to try to reduce the budget deficit and the balance of payments deficit. But their impact on welfare in Egypt is going to be devastating. Why? Because these two changes in particular will mean an immediate rise in the prices of all goods and services on the top of an already rampant inflation. Of course, if you increase the price of fuel stuffs, price of transport increases. If you reduce the value of the pound vis-a-vis the dollar in an economy that is critically dependent on imports from outside, not only for finished products for consumption, but for intermediate goods, then the prices of goods and services rise across the board. And without any government control of markets, many economic agents raise prices even if their cost has not changed. The bad news are not finished yet. It's all right. Can you see? Fine. No problem. Just 2 days ago, an appointed parliament, it is an appointed parliament. It's supposed to represent the people. But anybody who dares to make a statement under the dome defending the rights of the people is sent to disciplinary action. And almost every member of parliament was appointed by the security apparatus. Appointed, I mean, I'm not speaking of forging elections, I'm speaking of direct appointment. Anyway, that parliament passed without debate almost a new VAT tax. They imposed a 22% VAT charge on mobile phone communication, which is no longer a luxury commodity. I mean, it's a fact of life for almost everybody. Let me just point out that this is very close to the highest tax rate on income. I mean, the highest tax rate on income for individuals and corporate bodies is 22.5%. So the VAT on mobile communication is close to the highest tax rate on income. And most people who are to pay huge high taxes do not pay it simply because they hire the right accountants, and some of them get pardoned by a presidential decree. I mean, the ruling president has pardoned one Egyptian capitalist of 11 billion pounds of tax. And then they complain that they have no money. But they keep buying aircraft carriers, by the way. This is, I promised, the last of the bad news, the civil service law. This is a very interesting piece of legislation that was also passed unanimously by the parliament representing the people. It's widely expected that it will result in large-scale layoffs of government service people, excluding the army and the police, of course, in addition to many other requirements that were, again, technically advised by the IMF. There is another layer of inequality that will stem from the application of the civil service law. Certain government agencies are exempt by the letter of the law. The military, the police, the presidency, and the judiciary, the tools of oppression again. It even gets worse in terms of another layer of discrimination or inequality. Within these government bodies that are exempt from the law, only the top dogs are exempt. I mean, only police officers, but not everybody else in the police corps is exempt. Only military officers are exempt, but not the poor soldiers. Only judges, but not the poor court workers. Anyway, this is a very sad story in a sense, but I want to close as I opened with the wider historical context of the Arab liberation tide. And I claim that the ruling military establishment, in a blind drive to prolong its reign, is unwittingly creating the objective conditions for a new wave of the popular uprising. The popular uprising erupted to start against oppression and impoverishment. They're getting more of the same, and they are asking for it. Thank you.
Now I will introduce Nader Fergany. Give you a break. Dr. Fergany is an Egyptian sociologist and economist. He was the founding lead author of the Arab Human Development Report, 2002-2005, sponsored by the United Nations Development Program and the Arab Fund for Economic and Social Development. He obtained his BS from the Faculty of Economics and Political Sciences at Cairo University and his PhD from the University of North Carolina in the USA. He is presently the director of Almishkat Center for Research and Training in Cairo. Dr. Fergany taught and did research at numerous institutions in Egypt and outside, and acted as a consultant to many Arab and international organizations. He published on demography, international migration, labor markets, education, and development in Egypt and the Arab countries. His most recent book, Arab Revolution in the 21st Century, Lessons from Egypt and Tunisia, was published by Palgrave in 2016. Please welcome Dr. Fergany.
Near the end of the first decade of this century is the beginning of what might end up as the great Arab revolution of the 21st century. I understand what's happening now, but I want to stress the fact that these popular uprisings erupted in response to long decades of oppression and impoverishment in many Arab countries. it's not surprising that the slogans of these uprisings clamored for decent livelihood, freedom, social justice, and human dignity. But these uprisings erupted against a formidable array of foes, not only the authoritarian rule regimes that they wanted to overthrow, but their counterparts and supporters in the region and in the world. Hence, a very fierce counter-revolution erupted. And here I would like to just make sure that we understand that the very dire conditions. Thank you, Rima. A rather long title, so I'll leave you with it for a second. But the operative phrases are highlighted. حاضر. These are two quotes that I will leave with you, just to warn you that if you get the paper from Karim or Rima, there is an annex that develops the ideas here in a much fuller way. Let me start by some context and perhaps conceptual issues. ALT is the acronym I use for Arab Liberation Tide, which is the title I prefer for the unfortunate misnomer, the Arab Spring. I think what we witnessed, conditions we face in many Arab countries today, are not the results of the uprisings, they are the results of the counter-revolution. I start from standard tenet that knowledge is power, but knowledge works both ways. I mean, it can be a liberating factor for the oppressed, but it's also used to manipulate the masses by authoritarian rule regimes. In principle, I believe that despotic rule disdains knowledge and restricts information flows in societies. These are impossible to open. You're sweet. In these authoritarian rule regimes, I believe the standard mode is that decision-making is guided mostly by the interests of the ruling despot or clique. I mean, there could be one ultimate despot, but normally he is surrounded by a small clique that shares the same interests. Under these regimes, many horrid facts of life, and there is every attempt made to cover up for these horrid facts of life, and hence to prolong reign of these despotic regimes, information or truth is covered up or manipulated. As a byproduct of this statistical data production, in many Arab countries face technical problems to start. I'll try to mention some of them as I go along. And they suffer deficiencies as a result of basic inefficiency of government bureaucracies in backward countries. But there is also, and to me this is more important, a process of deliberate manipulation of statistical indicators of human